That's part of the reason why there's so much stuff in the lab that belongs to me, because, you know, we have nothing. All right, now, let's go over the cardiac cycle. You guys can hang in here. This is pretty intense, and then we'll be done with the chapter. Okay. All right, now, the reason why I went over and over and over and over the little story about how the blood moves through the heart is because this is where the rubber hits the road. When they start giving you pictures like this, and the next messy picture that we're going to look at, they are telling the same story. They're just doing it in a sciencey way. Okay. So, atrial systole is when the atria are contracted. Ventricular systole is when the ventricles are contracting. Ventricular diastole is when the ventricles are relaxed. Notice that during the later part of ventricular diastole is where you have blood flowing into the ventricles. Okay. The whole shooting match is called the cardiac cycle. You have atrial contraction, then ventricular contraction, and ventricular relaxation. Notice here, atrial systole lasts a very short period of time, and then the diastole lasts a long period of time. The ventricles contract for a longer period of time, and then they rest for a long period of time. Okay. Does everybody understand that? Okay, now, is there anything in biology? We're not talking astrophysics, we're talking biology. Is there anything that can continue to function without rest? No. No. Now, sometimes when people are writing prose or poetry, they will write as if the heart works day in and day out, all the time, without rest from the time you're born till the time you die. Okay. True or not? Mm-hmm. Totally not true. In the first place, your heart's working far before you were born. And in the second place, your ventricles actually relax almost 2/3 of the cardiac cycle. Okay, and the atria even more. Okay. So even though you have continuous cardiac function going on, that muscle contraction is not continuous. There is rest in there. I think that's kind of a pretty good object lesson there. Now, I hated these pictures when I was in school because I thought they were confusing. And they are, because your left brain looks at this and goes, ah! Okay? There isn't anything on this page that we haven't already talked about. Okay? So how do you look at this without going nuts? You take your page and you look at it just one piece at a time. Okay? So, what this is showing you is depictions of everything at the same time. Okay? You have, for the left heart, you have what's going on with the EKG, what's going on with the action potential. You have what you would hear with a stethoscope. You have your volume, that's how much blood and where is it. Okay. And then you have your pressure. Is something squeezing, and how hard is it squeezing? Okay. And then you have which valves are open and which valves are closed. Okay. Does everybody see that? Okay, so you already know this because you already know the little story we've been telling. You know that This line is your left ventricle. Okay. This line is your left atrium. This is your aorta up here. You already know that you've got blood flowing into your ventricle. Blood's coming in through your atrium and filling your ventricle. You know that when the atrium contracts, which is right here, right after the P wave, when the atrium contracts, it's going to shove a little bit more blood into the ventricle. That means that the pressure is going to rise a little bit. There's going to be a little bit more volume. Everybody with me? Yes, no, maybe, not your heads. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, now, that's when the ventricle's at rest. That's diastole. At the end of diastole, your ventricle is going to contract. Your ventricle needs a signal to contract. Here's your signal. Here's your QRS complex. When the ventricle begins to contract, the blood is going to want to run back in to the atria, so the AV valves are going to close. When those AV valves close, you get your first heart sound. Now, when you start to constrict or contract the ventricle, does the volume of blood change right away? Or ever, really? Does the volume of blood change? No, okay? But because you're squeezing on it, the pressure is going to go way up. Correct? Okay. When the pressure gets high enough, the back door opens. Okay? And then what happens to the blood volume? It runs out. Okay? When the pressure gets high enough that the back door opens, the blood's going to get squished out. What happens to the volume of blood in the ventricle then? It falls. What happens to the pressure then? It's going to fall too, because not only has the volume all rushed out, but now the ventricle is going to start to relax again. Okay? So the pressure goes up. As it does, the blood in the ventricle goes down. Okay? When the ventricle relaxes, okay, do you want that blood running back into the ventricle? No. So what closes? Your SL valves, and that's your S2. Okay. Does everybody see? Okay. So this is just depicting everything that we talked about so far. It's just doing it all at the same time. Okay. Now, the only thing that tends to make students a little crazy is this line here with the aorta. It's like, why do you have the pressure in the aorta on there? The reason is because you're talking about the left ventricle, and the left ventricle is shoving blood out into the heart. Excuse me, the left ventricle is shoving blood out into the aorta. Okay. So, is the aortic pressure ever zero? No, if it was zero, the blood wouldn't flow. Okay? The aorta is actually like, it's got like rubber bands in the walls. So when you shove a bunch of blood into the aorta, it expands. And then when there's less blood being shoved in, it contracts. Now, if a rubber band is contracting, is it going to push on things? Yes, so the walls, as they come in, they're going to push on the blood. So there's always pressure on the blood in the system. That's what this is showing you. There's always pressure on the blood in the aorta. But when the left ventricle opens up and starts squeezing blood, that pressure goes way up. It starts out at the diastolic pressure, which is about what? What's the normal diastolic pressure, folks? 60, 70. Okay. And then when the left ventricle contracts during systole, the pressure in the arteries goes up to 110, 120, something like that. Okay. So this is what's happening to the pressure in the aorta. This is your blood pressure. Okay. This is what you're being taught to measure in your skills classes. Okay. Now, this dichrotic notch here, what that means is when the pressure starts to drop in the aorta, because the ventricle is no longer squeezing on it, okay. The ventricle is no longer squeezing blood into the aorta, so the pressure starts to drop, and then the elastic snaps back and brings the pressure back up so that it flows evenly. So your blood flows down the vessels. It doesn't start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. Okay. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the only other thing on here that you have not seen is these little letters. Okay. SV stands for systolic volume. That's the amount of blood in the ventricle that the ventricle can shove out with one contraction. So your systolic volume here is going to be the amount that you started out with at the end of diastole minus the amount that you ended up with. Okay, so N diastolic volume and N systolic volume. The amount that you started out with at the end of diastole down to the amount that you still have at the end of systole. Does your heart ever squeeze all the blood out with each heartbeat? No, you can look here. So there's still a little bit remaining here. Okay. I said systolic volume. That's actually stroke volume. This is N diastolic volume, N systolic volume, and the SV here is stroke volume. Okay. Do you care? Yes, you do. Because next chapter we're getting into blood pressure and the things that affect blood pressure.
So the stroke volume is the difference between the N diastolic and the N systolic.
Yes. All right, and the pictures get messier from there. They're all just arranged. Here you have more than one heartbeat.
Yeah.
Okay. Same story. Okay. And I always look at that and go, ugh. Okay, but it's the same story. You just take it a piece at a time. Okay. All right, one last thing. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that the ventricle squeezes out with each heartbeat. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that the ventricle squeezes out with each heartbeat. Now, there are several things that are going to influence stroke volume. The first thing, you're going to go, well, duh. The first thing that influences stroke volume is whether you have any blood coming into the heart in the first place. You can't pump any out if you don't have any coming in. Okay. That's called preload. Up to a point, your heart can pump out more blood if it's got more blood coming in. Right? One of those dumb things. So if you increase the preload, in general, you're going to increase the stroke volume. Okay, all other things working the way they're supposed to. Like doping? To an extent. Okay. Now, can you patch on so much preload that the heart can't handle it? Yes, and that's called cardiac failure. Okay. All right, afterload. How much pressure is the heart pumping against? Now, think about it. If you're trying to shove a bunch of water somewhere, it's pretty easy to shove water into a wide open empty swimming pool, right? It's a little hard to shove water in a pipe that already has water in it, right? Okay. Especially if it's a stiff pipe that already has water in it. Okay. To shove that water in there takes a lot more force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Afterload is how hard the heart has to work to shove the blood out. And that's going to depend on the pressure in the aorta primarily. If your aorta is stiff and tiny, what does that do to the afterload? Yeah, it increases it because it makes it harder for the left ventricle to shove blood into it. Okay. So what does cardiovascular disease do to the afterload? Increases it. What does it do to the heart? It makes it harder for the heart to pump. Okay. So afterload is largely reflected in your diastolic blood pressure. So if you've heard people say it's worse to have a high diastolic blood pressure than a high systolic blood pressure, that's the reason why. Because the diastolic blood pressure is what's already there. That's what your heart's having to pump against to shove more blood into the system. Afterload. All right, so depending on what it is that you're trying to fix with your patient, you can modify preload and you can modify afterload. But we have to talk a little bit more about the blood pressure and some other things before we start monkeying with that stuff. Okay, questions? You guys are getting toast. Turn the lamp toward. Okay, now, here, over. Who did I give these to?
Rachel and I.
Okay, all right. I'm going to let you 2, 3 decide how you want to do this. My suggestion is that you have one group in here and maybe one group in there. Okay, and then switch groups. Okay. You want to do it that way? Sure. Or yes, no, maybe?
Or maybe just take it half one.
No, I want them to do a small group.
And I also posted to our Facebook page, our old Margot from my old class. She took the pictures and all the veins and the hearts and did that spreadsheet and all of that. That's posted to our Facebook page. It's awesome.
I'm going to tell her you call her the old Margaret.
You can. Hopefully she won't be that personal. She knows I won't be no person.
That's her name. Her name is other Margot.
Margaret, that's great.
Yes.
All right. Elena, you want in here or you want over there?
Oh, I can go over there.
Okay, so some of you guys go over there.
We have to let them.
All right. You guys go with